When I look at what's happening in China right now, the word that comes to my mind is not collapse. It's strain. The kind of strain you see in a suspension bridge just before the cables start to snap one by one. There's something unsettling about watching the world's second largest economy grapple with forces that have historically brought down much smaller nations. China's debt to GDP ratio has crossed 300%. Let me put that in perspective for you. When Japan hit similar levels in the early 1990s, it triggered what economists now call the lost decades. When the United States reached comparable household debt levels in 2007, we got the subprime mortgage crisis. But China is operating at a scale that makes those previous crises look like dress rehearsals. The numbers coming out of Beijing tell a story that should make anyone who understands economic history deeply uncomfortable. Evergrande Group, once the poster child of China's property boom, was finally liquidated earlier this year after owing creditors roughly 2 trillion yuan. That's about $310 billion. To put that in context, that's larger than the GDP of most developed nations. Country Garden, another property giant, just reported a record loss of 49.5 billion yuan for 2024. These aren't just corporate failures, they're systematic breakdowns of an economic model that powered China's growth for nearly 3 decades. But here's what really keeps me up at night: the so called ghost cities. We're not talking about a few empty developments scattered around the countryside. We're talking about entire metropolitan areas, complete with shopping centers, residential complexes, and infrastructure sitting vacant. The satellite images are haunting. Row after row of apartment towers with no lights in the windows, highways that lead nowhere, airports serving no passengers. These aren't just failed urban planning experiments, they're physical manifestations of a systematic misallocation of capital on a scale that defies historical precedent. The mechanism behind this crisis is both simple and terrifying. For years, Chinese local governments have relied on land sales to finance their operations. They would seize agricultural land, rezone it for development, and sell it to property companies at massive markups. This created a perverse incentive structure where everyone, local officials, developers, banks, and even individual families, became addicted to ever rising real estate prices. Think about how this worked in practice. A property developer like Evergrande would buy land from a local government using borrowed money. They would then sell apartments to families before the buildings were even constructed, using those pre-sale funds to buy more land and start new projects. Meanwhile, Chinese families with limited investment options due to capital controls poured their savings into real estate, convinced that property prices could only go up. The psychology behind this was fascinating and terrifying. Entire extended families would pool resources to buy multiple apartments, treating them like stock portfolios rather than places to live. This is what economists call a Ponzi scheme, though Chinese officials would never use that term. Like all Ponzi schemes, it worked beautifully as long as new money kept flowing in. Chinese households saw their wealth multiply as property values soared. Local governments collected massive revenues from land sales. Developers became billionaires overnight. Banks made enormous profits on construction loans. But there's an iron law in economics: nothing that can't go on forever won't. And by 2021, the Chinese government itself recognized that this model was becoming dangerous. They introduced what they called the three red lines: debt limits that property developers had to meet. Almost overnight, the flow of credit to the property sector dried up. What happened next shouldn't surprise anyone familiar with financial history. Developers who had been juggling dozens of projects suddenly couldn't pay their bills. Construction stopped on half-finished buildings. Families who had paid for apartments that might never be completed took to the streets in protest. Banks found themselves holding worthless collateral as property values began to fall. The scale of this unwinding is staggering. Real estate, which once accounted for as much as 24% of China's GDP, has shrunk to about 19%. Housing starts have fallen by more than 60% compared to pre-pandemic levels. According to the International Monetary Fund, this represents one of the fastest housing busts in modern economic history. But here's where the story gets more complex and more dangerous. Unlike the property crashes we've seen in other countries, Chinese authorities are actively preventing the market from clearing. They've instructed banks to delay recognizing bad loans. They've set up guidelines to limit how much property prices can fall. They've created white lists of approved developers who can still access credit. This might sound like smart crisis management, but economic history suggests otherwise. When Japan tried similar tactics in the 1990s, propping up insolvent banks, preventing asset prices from falling, keeping zombie companies alive, it extended what should have been a sharp but brief recession into 20 years of stagnation. The human cost of China's approach is already becoming visible. I think about the millions of Chinese families who put their life savings into apartments that may never be finished. Under China's pre-sale system, buyers pay for apartments before construction begins. If the developer goes bankrupt, those families lose everything. There's no deposit insurance, no government guarantee, no legal recourse. The geographic scope of this crisis is what makes it truly unprecedented. We're not talking about isolated bubbles in a few major cities. Property prices became disconnected from economic fundamentals across hundreds of Chinese cities. Tier 3 and Tier 4 cities, places most Americans have never heard of, built luxury developments as if they were Manhattan or San Francisco. Let me give you a specific example that illustrates the madness. In Inner Mongolia, local officials built a new city called Kongbashi, designed to house 1 million people. Today, fewer than 100,000 people live there. The city has a massive government complex, multiple shopping centers, and residential towers that stretch to the horizon. But at night, you can drive for miles without seeing a single lit window. This pattern repeated itself across China. Cities built opera houses before they had orchestras. They constructed airports before they had airlines. They developed university campuses before they had students. The result is a country dotted with what researchers estimate to be enough empty housing to accommodate 250 million people. The international implications of China's property crisis extend far beyond China's borders. China is the world's largest economy after the United States. It's the biggest trading partner for more than 120 countries. If Chinese domestic demand collapses and property related spending represents a huge chunk of that demand, the ripple effects will be felt from Germany's export sector to Australia's mining industry. This interconnectedness means that what started as a Chinese real estate bubble has the potential to become a global economic event. We're already seeing signs of this global transmission. Chinese imports of iron ore, copper, and other raw materials have fallen sharply as construction activity declined. European luxury brands that built their growth strategies around Chinese consumers are reporting disappointing sales. Even emerging markets that export commodities to China are feeling the pinch. But there's an even more fundamental issue at stake here: the sustainability of China's entire growth model. For 4 decades, China's economy has been driven by investment, building factories, infrastructure, and yes, housing. This investment led model allowed China to grow at double digit rates for years, lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. However, there's a point where additional investment starts to yield diminishing returns. Building the first airport in a city creates enormous economic value. Building the second airport creates much less. Building the third airport might actually destroy value if it sits empty. Economists have a term for this. Capital deepening eventually becomes capital wasteland. China appears to have crossed this threshold. The country now has more high speed rail track than the rest of the world combined, but much of it operates at a loss. China produces more steel than the next 10 countries combined, but steel prices have collapsed due to oversupply. China has built more solar panel manufacturing capacity than global demand can absorb, leading to bankruptcies and trade disputes. The property sector was supposed to be different. Unlike steel mills or solar panel factories, housing serves an obvious human need. But even housing becomes a wasteland when you build more units than people need or can afford. And that's exactly what China has done. Local government finances add another layer of complexity to this crisis. Chinese local governments don't have the same taxing authority as their counterparts in developed economies. They can't easily raise income taxes or property taxes to fund their operations. Instead, they've become dependent on land sales revenue, money that disappears when property developers stop buying land. This dependency created what economists call a resource curse, abundance of one revenue source that crowds out the development of more sustainable fiscal mechanisms. This has created what economists call a fiscal cliff for hundreds of Chinese cities. Without land sales revenue, these governments can't pay for basic services, let alone service their debts. Many have turned to complex financial vehicles, local government financing vehicles, or LGFVs, to keep borrowing. These entities have accumulated trillions of yuan in debt, much of it guaranteed implicitly by the central government. The parallels to previous debt crises are sobering. In the 1980s, Latin American countries borrowed heavily based on the assumption that commodity prices would remain high forever. When commodity prices crashed, these countries found themselves unable to service their debts, triggering what became known as the lost decade for Latin America. China's situation is different in important ways. Most of its debt is denominated in its own currency, and the government maintains tight control over capital flows. But the underlying dynamic is similar, an economy that has borrowed heavily against the assumption that a particular asset class, in this case real estate, would appreciate indefinitely. What makes China's situation particularly precarious is the role that property plays in household wealth. In most developed economies, households diversify their wealth across stocks, bonds, bank deposits, and real estate. In China, capital controls and underdeveloped financial markets have pushed households to concentrate their wealth in property. Real estate accounts for roughly 70% of Chinese household assets. This concentration creates what economists call systemic vulnerability. When one asset class dominates household balance sheets, its decline can trigger consumption collapses that reverberate throughout the entire economy. This means that falling property prices don't just hurt developers and banks, they directly impact consumer spending power. Chinese families feel poorer when their apartments lose value, and they respond by cutting back on consumption. This creates a vicious cycle where weak consumption leads to slower economic growth, which puts further downward pressure on property prices. The demographic dimension of this crisis makes it even more challenging. China's working age population peaked around 2015 and has been declining since then. This demographic shift means that the natural demand for housing, young people forming households and buying their first homes, is weakening precisely when China has a massive oversupply of housing. Japan faced a similar demographic challenge in the 1990s, and the results weren't encouraging. An aging population meant fewer people buying homes, which contributed to the prolonged decline in property prices. China's one child policy, which was in effect for more than 3 decades, has created an even more severe demographic challenge than Japan faced. International observers have proposed various solutions to China's property crisis, but each comes with significant political and economic costs. The government could let property prices fall to market clearing levels, but this would wipe out household wealth and potentially trigger social unrest. It could bail out developers and banks, but this would reward bad behavior and encourage future risk taking. Alternatively, China could try to transition away from its investment driven growth model toward consumption driven growth. This sounds appealing in theory, but it's extraordinarily difficult in practice. It would require fundamental reforms to the financial system, the tax system, and the social safety net. It would also likely mean accepting much slower economic growth for years or decades. The global stakes of China's choices are enormous. If China manages a relatively smooth transition away from property driven growth, the global economy might experience a period of slower but more sustainable expansion. If China's property crisis triggers a broader financial meltdown, we could see a global recession that makes 2008 look manageable. There are already signs that Chinese policymakers are struggling with these trade offs. They've announced stimulus measures aimed at supporting the property sector, but these measures have been modest compared to the scale of the problem. They've talked about boosting domestic consumption, but consumer confidence remains weak amid falling property values. Meanwhile, China's approach to the crisis is creating new distortions in the global economy. Chinese companies faced with weak domestic demand are aggressively exporting their products to international markets. This is contributing to trade tensions with the United States and Europe, who argue that China is dumping excess capacity on global markets. The irony is that China's leaders clearly understand the risks they face. Xi Jinping has spoken repeatedly about the need to avoid systemic financial risks. Chinese regulators have implemented numerous measures designed to prevent a property crash, but understanding a problem and solving it are two different things, especially when the problem is this large and this deeply embedded in the country's economic structure. What we're witnessing in China is a real time experiment in whether a government can engineer a soft landing for an economy that has become dependent on unsustainable asset price appreciation. The historical record for such experiments is not encouraging. Most countries that have faced similar challenges have experienced either a sharp recession that clears the market or a prolonged period of stagnation as they try to avoid the pain of adjustment. The ghost cities scattered across China serve as a physical reminder of what happens when investment decisions become disconnected from economic reality. These empty developments represent trillions of yuan in misallocated capital, resources that could have been used to build schools, hospitals, or infrastructure that people actually needed. But perhaps more importantly, they represent a warning about the dangers of mistaking financial engineering for genuine wealth creation. For years, rising property prices made it seem like China had discovered a new model of economic development. In reality, much of that apparent wealth was illusory, the product of a speculative bubble that was always destined to burst. As I watch this crisis unfold, I'm reminded of something the economist Hyman Minsky once wrote: stability is destabilizing. China's long period of rapid growth and rising property prices created the conditions for its current crisis. The very success of the property driven growth model convinced participants that it could continue indefinitely. The question now is whether China can navigate this transition without triggering a broader economic collapse. The answer to that question won't just determine China's future, it will shape the global economy for decades to come. And right now, despite all the official optimism coming from Beijing, I'm not sure anyone really knows what the answer will be. What I do know is that empty cities don't lie. They stand as monuments to the dangers of confusing speculation with investment and debt with wealth. And they serve as a reminder that in economics, as in physics, what goes up very fast often comes down even faster. The ghost cities of China aren't just a Chinese problem, they're a warning about what happens when entire nations convince themselves that financial engineering can replace the fundamental laws of economics. The question isn't whether this will end, but how many other countries will learn from China's experiment before it's too late.